Morning YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Sunday the 16th of July, just getting ready for the roundtable discussion.
Monday roundtable, a lot of issues, a great panel. We've got a lot to talk about this morning. The sudden resignation of the Greens deputy leader, the impasse at the Council of Australian Governments meeting over the clean energy target, and Malcolm Turnbull's mission to bring the rule of law to the dark corners of the internet, opposite given the background briefing program that we heard. And joining us this morning, Clive Hamilton, Professor of Public Ethics at the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics, and Clive also holds the Vice-Chancellor's Chair in Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University. Clive, welcome to Sunday Extra. G'day. And Rebecca, yeah, very good. I'm glad to have you with us, Clive. And Rebecca Weiss, Research Associate at the Centre for Independent Studies. Great to have you, Rebecca.
Lovely to be here, Andrew.
All right, let's get cracking. Let's start with this shock resignation of the Greens Senator Scott Ludlam from WA. He resigned on Friday after realising he still holds New Zealand citizenship along with his Australian citizenship, and that does make him ineligible under the Constitution to sit as a senator. Here's how Scott Ludlam explained the oversight.
I was born in New Zealand in Palmerston North, left when I was 3 years old, and settled in Australia not that long before my 9th birthday. And I was naturalised in my mid-teens, and at that point I thought, you leave New Zealand citizenship behind. And obviously that's an avoidable oversight. That's something that's entirely my responsibility.
Clive, Scott Ludlam says, look, he was unaware of this until someone alerted him. Is that an acceptable reason?
Well, I mean, carelessness can be taken a bit too far, I think. I mean, it does seem that Scott wasn't aware, but probably should have been. I mean, people have pointed out there was a change.org petition going around asking him about Obama style to produce his birth certificate almost to prove he wasn't a New Zealand citizen. You'd think that would set up a bit of an alarm bell. And of course, there have been other challenges to citizenship, the citizenship of senators and members. So, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty bad mistake. It's not really forgivable for someone in that position, I think.
Rebecca, Scott Ludlam has been a senator since 2008. Are we going to see the Senate having to go back all over the votes that he's participated in as a now ineligible member of the Senate? Are we going to have to trawl over those votes?
No, I understand that that has already been decided that that's not the case. What is now being examined is obviously he has to resign as he has, and the normal procedure would be that he has to repay his salary. And there is obviously debate about that. How much should he repay? I think it's very interesting because the Greens, I understand, have a tithe, and so a certain amount of that salary goes to the Greens. I accept him, he's quite right to say he had full responsibility, but I think the Greens, and indeed any political party that puts forward a candidate, also has a responsibility to ensure that they comply with the law in all respects. So I think that there's a very strong case that the Greens should repay that tithe, and that would obviously be a lot easier for them than individually for Scott. But I mean, we are looking at Senators Bob Day, or former Senator Bob Day and Cullerton having to repay, and I think the case for repayment is very strong.
Yes, I think the Labor MPs also pay a tithe as well. Back to the party. Clive, you're an ethicist and a noted one. Let me ask you about the ethics of dual citizenship. It is permissible, I think, if you're going to sit in some state parliaments. Do you think we're being a bit too fussy? I know it's a constitutional requirement, but I just wonder, is there a problem with dual citizenship from an ethical point of view for federal MPs?
I think that the dual citizenship issue is actually likely to become a much more serious one in Australia. People who hold dual citizenship with New Zealand, we're not going to be too worried about loyalty questions, or Britain perhaps. But what about China? The penetration of the Chinese party state into Australia, and some prominent Australian citizens who also hold dual Chinese citizenship, is certainly ringing alarm bells in ASIO. The curious thing is that legally, it's, in China, you cannot hold dual citizenship. They take a very strong view on this. But in practice, they do allow certain citizens, those prominent ones, and those are politically useful, to be joint Australian Chinese citizens. So, given the nature of China, the nature of Chinese party state and its ambitions, I think this will become a big problem in Australia. So I'm in favour of enforcing this question of having no doubts about the loyalty of our serving members.
Rebecca, if you look at the results of the census that's just come out in the last few months, or last few weeks actually, I think we're now coming pretty close to 50% of Australians who are either first or second generation immigrants. So, and of course, you know, they're fully participating Australian citizens. If we want to include those people in the full life of our nation, and many of them will have two passports, do we need to rethink the idea of the prohibition on dual citizenship for federal MPs?
Well, I think I take both an ethical and a pragmatic position on this. I mean, pragmatically, it's very difficult to change the Constitution, and I think if we were looking to change things, this wouldn't be first cab off the rank, in my opinion. Apart from that, I do agree that I think it's important, particularly when you're either a recent migrant or one generation after. You do, and I say this as someone, my father came here as a stateless citizen and became a very proud Australian citizen, joined the Australian Army in the course of World War II. I think that you have to ask yourself, when you come from that sort of background, where do I belong? And I certainly interrogated myself about this, and make clear to yourself where your allegiance lies, and that can be divided for many people for many reasons, and for that reason I think it's very important to as particularly when you take the point of going into Parliament to do that.
Well, you and Clive have a unity ticket on this. Clive, just before we leave this subject, you stood briefly, I think, as a Greens candidate. You know a bit about the party. What's this going to mean for the Greens, who've lost their deputy leader, and agree or disagree with Scott Ludlam's politics? He was a very eloquent and sort of switched-on guy. What's it going to mean for the party?
Yeah, Scott brought a particular kind of demographic, and he expanded the area and the kind of scope of what the Greens were doing. So it will be a really significant loss for the party, and will throw it into some turmoil. And there are, as you know, particularly in New South Wales, other issues going on. So the Greens are going through a really quite difficult period at the moment. I mean, they'll find their way through. But I think it will definitely create some difficulties for them. It's unlikely to lead to the kind of massive factional backs that these kinds of things generally spark in the Labor Party and the Liberal Party.
Yes, well, factions. I think Tom covered that exhaustively last week in at least one of our parties, our governing party. Let's move on to COAG and energy policy. The federal, state and territory energy ministers have endorsed 49 out of the 50 recommendations of the Finkel Review into Australia's energy needs. That was at Friday's meeting of the Council of Australian Governments. But the one that they left out, the one out of the 50, was a commitment to a clean energy target. The federal government said it won't commit to a clean energy target, but several states now say, look, we want to push ahead with our own clean energy targets, go our own way. Rebecca, the coalition government in Canberra says it cannot commit, and the state governments, Labor governments at least, say, look, we can't wait any longer. So are we any closer to a bipartisan policy on energy security? And indeed, is a bipartisan policy a good thing?
Well, I think that the decision, as I understand it, from COAG on Friday was that COAG would not pursue anything as a group, as a whole, and that individual states, and particularly Labor states in the Australian Capital Territory, would do further research on a clean energy target. And I think that makes sense, because that's in fact what the federal government is doing itself. The coalition is doing further research into the clean energy target, which does seem so far to have had flawed modelling as far as this target is concerned. So I certainly think that they need to go back and revisit the modelling. And in my opinion, the decision has been sensible so far from both parties in that regard.
Clive, you served, I think, on the Climate Commission. Is that right?
The Climate Change Authority.
The Climate Change Authority.
4.5 authorities until earlier this year.
Yeah, and your latest book is about climate change. I mean, is this another lost opportunity?
Oh, yes, another in a long and tragic line. We don't need more modelling. I mean, everybody knows really who thinks about what we need to do. I mean, here in the ACT, by 2020, we will have 100% clean energy in our electricity system, 100%. And that's because the citizens want it. And the Labor states are responding to the demands of their citizens. People want to see Australia make the transition to clean energy targets. The Labor Party does, the Greens do, most of the Liberal Party does. But, you know, there's been this penetration of power of this Conservative faction which has come in the last 10 or 15 years, which sees energy policy now as an ideological battle. It's part of the wider cultural war, and they've just created enormous problems within the Liberal Party, which has gone as far as denying the science, essentially standing in the way of the Enlightenment. I mean, this is just crazy politics and just leaves Australia further behind the world.
Rebecca, I don't know if you're a cultural warrior, but you're certainly an ideas person. You're at the Centre for Independent Studies. Is Clive right, though? There is an ideology in this. I mean, isn't there? There are ideological battles going on over the question of clean energy and coal.
Well, I think that one thing we can say for sure is that Clive and I are not on a unity on this. I am a great believer, and I think that what Australians want is reliable, affordable, secure energy. And I do agree that a lot of people, it's been very popular to talk about renewable energy. And I think a lot of people in the general public think that renewable energy is cheap because the sun shines for free and the wind blows for free. But of course, harnessing sunshine and harnessing wind power is not free. It's extremely expensive. And the only way that it can be done at the moment is by subsidising it from fossil fuels. And 100% renewable energy for anybody that isn't lucky enough to, for example, live and be able to get everything out of a hydroelectric dam. And even then, the turbines have to be built using fossil fuel power and so forth. So it's not possible at the moment. It's certainly not affordable and it's not secure.
Okay, just before we leave this topic, the Labor states and the ACT committed to a zero net emissions target by 2050. But during the week, we heard the Liberal backbencher Craig Kelly, who chairs the Coalition's Environment and Energy Committee, say that subsidies for renewable energy could be responsible for people dying this winter because they've pushed up the price of electricity. Here's what Craig Kelly said.
People will die. We've seen reports only recently that 1 in 4 Australian households this winter will be frightened to turn the heater on because of the price of electricity. We also know that the World Health Organization has made it very, very clear that you increase winter mortality. That means you have more people dying in winter if they cannot afford to heat their homes.
Clive, surely he's got a point.
Oh, it's just bonkers. I mean, really. I mean, the data on the number of people who die from the burning of fossil fuels is robust, well established, and much stronger than anything that Craig Kelly might suggest. And look, when we have clean energy policies as Labor introduced several years ago, they recognised that there would be certain low-income households that would face a rising cost in the medium term, and that therefore there were compensatory mechanisms. I mean, it's perfectly standard public policy. And on the cost of renewables, I mean, the truth is when the wind blows harder in South Australia, the electricity price goes down. So the problem in Australia is not that we have too much renewable energy, it's that we don't have enough. I mean, once we make the transition to a substantial portion of our electricity grid being supplied by renewable sources from a range of areas, backed up by batteries. It's going to be an enormous rush over the next 5 to 10 years. We will have a safe, secure, sustainable and cheaper supply of energy across Australia.
All right, let's move on. It's Sunday Extra, and Andrew West in for Tom this week, and our round table is Professor Clive Hamilton of Charles Sturt University and Rebecca Weiss at the Centre for Independent Studies. The Prime Minister has...
And we're on the upload limit. Back immediately.